The clock that only showed 3:33 and repeated the same sounds. Every night, have you ever seen a clock that never changes time? Now imagine one that only shows 3:33 every night, and that even when stopped, insists on making the same metallic sound in the dark, always at the same rhythm, always at the same time. Rafael thought it was just a family heirloom, a worthless relic. But everything changed the night he responded to the sound. The clock is working again, and time around simply stopped. From then on, he discovered that spiritual inheritances don't just come with objects, they come with debts. And some keep running, even when time stops. If that already gave you goosebumps, imagine what comes next. So leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and get ready to find out what happens when time stops. But the mystery remains. Rafael never had a strong connection with his great-grandfather. In fact, he knew very little about him. Only what the family let slip in brief. Uncomfortable conversations. A reserved man devoted to spiritual practices, who lived secluded in an old house far from the city, surrounded by books on the occult, astrological charts, alchemical symbols, and dark wooden objects, as if time had stopped there. When he passed away, he left almost nothing to the family, except for one enigmatic item, an old solid wood clock with hand-carved details and a strange inscription on the back. Time is due. In Latin, the time is due. Rafael didn't understand why it had been left for him. He'd never been close to the old man, but he felt a shiver when he first held the watch in his hands. It was heavy, as if it held more than just gears. The dial was strange, with symbols that didn't resemble numbers, and hands as black as cast iron. Even so, Rafael decided to take it home. He left the object on the living room shelf, more as a curious piece than out of sentimental attachment. The first night, Rafael woke suddenly at 3:33. He glanced at the digital clock on his cell phone and cringed, the room feeling cold, even in the middle of summer. When he went to the living room, he noticed that the old clock had stopped at exactly 3:33. He thought it was strange, but attributed it to chance. The next day, he tried to wind the clock. The hands moved, but when he reached 3:33 again, it stopped again, always at 3:33. In the days that followed, Rafael noticed that the clock never went past this time. He could adjust it manually, and yet when dawn arrived, it would stop. Stranger still, even though it wasn't working, the clock seemed to emit a faint metallic sound in the middle of the night, attic tick muffled, which didn't correspond to the movement of any gears. It was as if he were breathing, as if he were waiting for something. Intrigued, Rafael decided to take a closer look at the object's details. Using a flashlight, he illuminated every corner. On the sides of the wood, occult symbols were carved in bas relief. An hourglass between two eyes, a broken mirror, and a serpent biting its own tail. On the bottom, besides the Latin inscription, there was a thin layer of dried varnish, almost as if it were hiding something. During a video call with his mother, he mentioned the clock. She fell silent. Her eyes widened slightly, but she quickly covered it up. "That's not something you should have in your house, Rafael." When he tried to insist, she simply asked him not to mess with it too much. "Your great-grandfather had secrets, and that clock was one of them." But Rafael was too curious. What could an object do? It was just wood and metal. But he was beginning to doubt that, because every morning when the clock stopped at 3:33, he woke up, even without an alarm, always at the same minute, and always with the same feeling in his chest that someone was watching. Without realizing it, Rafael had inherited more than just a clock. He had also inherited silence, a silence thick with the past, and perhaps with debts that weren't even his. Yet the clock was there, still, patient, and eternally marking the time when something had been interrupted or sealed. Time, for Rafael, was beginning to cease to be merely a continuous line. It began to behave like a warning. An antique clock, made of dark wood, inherited from a man who had defied the rules of existence, and now, perhaps, was waiting for the next to do the same. The second week with the watch, was marked by a detail impossible to ignore: the metallic sound. It wasn't attic-tack ordinary, not a sound of a strained spring or a failing gear. It was something different, something alive. Every morning at exactly 3:33, the sound would appear. 3 dry, metallic knocks, as if someone were tapping the inside of the clock with a piece of iron in a rhythmic and deliberate pattern. It wasn't random, it was intentional. Rafael tried recording the first time with his cell phone, but the audio came out distorted, as if the microphone was filled with static at that particular moment. Still, curiosity overcame his fear. The next night, he set up his laptop with a more advanced audio recording program and set the microphone to face the clock, set to activate at exactly 3:30. The next morning, listening to the recording, his heart raced. The sound was there. 3 metallic beats, symmetrically spaced, followed by a low-frequency hum. When he played the waveform on the visualizer, he noticed something even stranger: the audio. Peaks had a repetitive, almost mathematical structure. It sounded like a sequence, a kind of code. Rafael had a degree in sound engineering and had already worked with spectrograms. He applied the recording pattern to software that allowed him to visualize sound in images, and there it was. A sequence of marks formed, drawing symbols that resembled letters, but not from a known alphabet. It looked like something ancient, with features reminiscent of both archaic Hebrew and sacred geometric shapes. A language, perhaps, but from where? He couldn't sleep after that. Every morning he sat in front of the clock with headphones on, analyzing every sound, every echo, every repetition. And every night at 3:33, the sounds came, always the same. No matter what he did, record it, ignore it, cover the clock with a thick cloth, or lock it in the closet, the sound penetrated everything and came straight to his ears, even in absolute silence. The neighbor from the apartment next door, Mrs. Glelia, casually commented as they passed in the elevator, "You've been hammering away late at night, haven't you? I hear a dry, metallic sound. I thought you were doing some renovations." Rafael froze. Could she hear it too? The woman was elderly and had hearing problems. How could she possibly have picked up on that exact thing? Rafael then decided to leave the city for 2 days, just to test it out. He took only some clothes and left his watch locked in a wooden box at the back of his closet. He went to a friend's house in another city, wanting to clear his head and get away from his obsession. But on his first night away, he woke with a start. Guess what? At 3:33. And the sound? There it was, inside his head. 3 knocks, as if echoing in his skull. He covered his ears, but it was no use. It was internal now. The next morning, he returned home. The box was as he had left it, but when he opened it, the clock hadn't stopped. The minute hand was spinning slowly, as if it were a vinyl. Record about to finish its last track, until it stopped again. At 3:33, it was at that moment that Rafael understood. The clock didn't need to be working to emit sound. It was a channel, a bridge. Perhaps it was recording, yes, but not on tape, but in his consciousness. And what's more, perhaps that sound wasn't meant for everyone. It was just for him, like a call or a password. A password that only he, for some reason, could decipher. And a disturbing question was formed. If the sound was a code, who was trying to communicate? Most importantly, what did they expect him to answer? The clock was a messenger, and Rafael was beginning to realize that he wasn't just an heir to dark wood. He was the recipient of something much greater, something that began with 3 metallic sounds in the darkness and seemed no longer to be ignored. By the 3rd week, the clock was no longer just a strange object in the room. It had become a presence. Rafael could no longer relax at home. It was as if the air had thickened, as if the invisible hands of time had spun around inside his head. And then the dreams began, or rather, the nightmares. The first was almost innocent. Rafael found himself in a dark house, similar to his great-grandfather's, but with endless corridors whose walls seemed to move as if they were alive. The doors slammed shut on their own, and in the background he heard the sound of the clock, the same one, metallic tick, marking a time that didn't move forward. At the end of the hallway, a cracked mirror reflected his image, but he wasn't himself. He had his great-grandfather's eyes. In the second nightmare, everything intensified. He walked through a labyrinth constructed of gigantic gears, as if trapped inside the clock itself. The corridors shifted, changing direction with every step. Around him, echoes of ancient voices, some murmuring in forgotten languages, others whispering his name with desperate urgency. In the center of the labyrinth, a clock melted. Like one in a Salvador Dali painting, yet it still steadily read 3:33. These dreams began to recur night after night with slight variations. Always the same pattern, the feeling of being guided by something invisible, always toward a cracked mirror. And always, on the other side of the glass, someone was waiting, a still figure, its face shrouded in shadow. Sometimes it was the height of an elderly man. Other times, it looked like himself, but older. In each case, this figure extended its hand, never going beyond the mirror. Rafael began waking up sweating, with a dry throat and wide eyes. He always woke at exactly 3:33. He looked at the living room clock. Still, he looked at his phone. The same time. Time seemed to revolve around that hour like a black hole. During the day, Rafael began to notice lapses in his attention. He would stand in front of the bathroom mirror for minutes, unable to remember what he had done. He would daydream, seeing fragments of his nightmares flash before his eyes, the faces, the hallways, the voices. He sought out a psychologist, but struggled to explain. You're dreaming about watches because you're obsessed with this object you inherited. Your subconscious is reacting. It was the logical explanation. But then Rafael performed the ultimate test. He removed the watch from the house. He took it to a family storage room in the countryside and left it locked inside a box with layers of fabric on top. He wanted to see if the dreams would stop. In night, the nightmare was different. Rafael was in his own house. He walked through the dark rooms, and everything seemed darker, as if reality were being consumed by dense shadows. When he passed the living room, the clock was there, on top of the bookshelf, and it was chiming. The sound of its gears was deafening. He tried to escape, but the house closed behind him, and when he reached the bedroom door, it was locked. The mirror on the wall shattered by itself, and on the other side, the shadowy figure entered through the crack. Rafael woke up with a scream stuck in his throat. He looked around. The clock was there, but the sound still echoed in his ears, those three metallic tones. The next morning, he received a call from the warehouse. The box where he'd left the watch was open, and no one knew how. The security cameras showed nothing, just a blur in the footage, precisely at 3:33. It was then that Rafael accepted. He wasn't just being haunted by dreams. He was being called. The nightmares were more than random visions. They were pathways, portals, warnings, and the clock was the key. And by all appearances, on the other side of the mirror, someone or something had been waiting for him for a long time. Rafael no longer knew what it was like to sleep a full night. Each nap was accompanied by increasingly lucid nightmares. The feeling was that there was no longer any difference between what he saw with his eyes closed and what he experienced awake. The voices in his dreams began to speak in full sentences, but always with a warning tone. And the clock, even though it wasn't present, appeared in every corner of the house. It appeared reflected in mirrors, in the microwave, even in the reflection of Rafael's eyes when he looked in the mirror. Time seemed to mock him or test his endurance. Tired, on a quiet late afternoon, Rafael decided to rummage through the boxes containing his great-grandfather's old belongings. Until then, he had ignored the yellowed papers, the notebooks with incomprehensible symbols, and the letters that seemed to be written in other languages. But something was driving him now, as if the answer lay there, hidden in plain sight. It was then that he found, deep Within a velvet-lined wooden drawer, a letter sealed with red wax. The seal bore the same serpent that was carved into the side of the clock, biting its own tail. The paper was aged, but the handwriting was firm, elegant. Signed, Raymond of Avila, 1949. Your great-grandfather. The letter appeared to have been written directly to someone in the family, but with no clear addressee. Its content was disturbing. If this letter has reached you, then time has closed again. I made a mistake that shouldn't be repeated. The clock is the seal. Never try to fix time that isn't yours. Time belongs to what is beyond matter. It marks a debt, one that cannot be paid with coins, nor with prayers. Rafael felt a deep shiver. The letter continued. I believed I could escape my fate, see beyond the curtain, predict the exact time of my death. I was foolish. I touched gears that should not be touched. The clock, once a ritual instrument, was corrupted by my vanity. Now it always marks the instant I crossed the line. 3:33, the time the door opened. Rafael let the letter fall for a moment. His head throbbed. What did his great-grandfather mean by open door? Was it symbolic or literal? In the final part of the letter, the most disturbing revelation. Whoever inherits the clock also inherits the bill. The debt is passed down through blood. I tried to contain the curse. I used symbols, binding spells, seals on mirrors, but all I could do was delay it. Time always takes its toll. If you're reading this, don't try to understand. Don't try to win. Just listen and don't respond. Rafael folded the letter with trembling hands. The warning seemed clear and yet impossible to follow. Listen and don't answer. But he had already answered. He had already recorded the sounds. He had already spoken during the nightmares. He had already called. Was he condemned for something that wasn't even his choice? He then decided to review the other papers. Among the notebooks, he found a fragmented diary of his great-grandfather. On one of the pages, drawn with charcoal and crooked lines, was a ritual circle. In the center of it, a clock. And below, the soul that tries to manipulate time will be possessed by it. Rafael recoiled. That made everything even more real. His great-grandfather had tried through rituals to see the future, perhaps predict his own death. This went against everything known as natural, and the result was the imprisonment of his soul, perhaps in an endless cycle, trapped in that cursed instant 3:33. Now the clock was Rafael's, the spiritual debt was in his hands, and every metallic sound, every cracked mirror, every nightmare, it was part of the reckoning. He was no longer just an heir. It was next in line, or maybe outside of it. Rafael could no longer distinguish reality from delirium. The dream voices, the metallic sound at 3:33, the mirrors with impossible reflections, everything had become part of a distorted routine where time seemed to double back on itself. Some days he felt as if everything were on repeat. On others, it was as if time around him had slowed down and everyone moved in slow motion, except him. But something new was happening. The clock sound, the metallic thuds began to subtly change. They still occurred at 3:33 a.m., but now they were accompanied by different pauses, almost as if they were waiting for a response, like an incomplete code, waiting for the other half. Rafael spent 3 consecutive nights analyzing the new recordings. He mapped the patterns with mathematical precision. He noticed that after each sequence of 3 beats, there was a longer pause, then 3 more beats, and again, a pause. It was like a single-voice dialogue, a call, and it grew louder and louder, as if the clock were getting closer to the answer it wanted. Tired, distraught, and emotionally drained, Rafael sat in the living room that early morning, clutching his great-grandfather's letter between his fingers. The warning still echoed, "Listen and don't respond." But he had already passed that point. He had already recorded, analyzed, deciphered. He had already dreamed of the other side. Perhaps it was inevitable. And it was exactly at 3:33 that he made the decision. The sound started as always. News, news, news. The pause, the echo, the shadows in the room shimmered as if the air were thicker. Rafael took a deep breath. He leaned back in his chair, and breaking all the warnings that had been hammering at his conscience for days, he spoke aloud. "I am here." The sound stopped immediately. The clock, sitting on the shelf, gave a sharp click, as if something inside had unlocked, and then the second hand moved. A single movement. Rafael looked around. Everything was still. Absolute silence. Not a sound from the refrigerator, not the street noise, not the hum of electricity in the wires. The air seemed frozen. Rafael tried to stand, but his body felt heavy, as if being sucked in by gravity itself. And when he looked at his phone, the screen was frozen at 3:33. It didn't blink. It didn't respond to touch. That's when he understood. Time had stopped. Literally. He wasn't the only one trapped. Everything around him was suspended in an endless second. The clock's hands remained still, but Rafael felt, almost like a physical intuition, that he was now on another plane, something subtle between matter and spirit, a plane of transition. He struggled to his feet and walked around the house. The world around him seemed made of glass. When he looked out the window, the street was motionless. A car stopped at the intersection. A dove frozen in the sky, a pedestrian with his foot suspended in mid-air. Everything was still. He went to the hallway mirror, and there she was, the figure of dreams. This time there were no cracks. The glass was intact, like a crystal-clear window between two worlds, and on the other side, a room identical to her own, but darker in tone, as if the shadows were alive. The figure before her looked up. It was her great-grandfather, younger than in the photos, but with eyes heavy with time and guilt. He seemed trapped, like a repeated image, desperate to be freed. Rafael tried to touch the glass, but a counterforce prevented him. Even so, the connection was made. The clock behind the reflection pulsed in sync with his own. And for the first time, Rafael heard the figure's voice, not in sound, but directly in his mind. "Now you're in. There's no going back." At that moment, everything shook. A vibration rippled through the ground, as if reality were rearranging itself. Time ceased to be something external. Rafael felt the gears turning inside it, and then he realized that "I'm here" wasn't a simple answer. Outside the password, outside the missing key, and now he was where his great-grandfather had once been, stuck between the seconds, in the land where time does not obey the laws of men. The first thing Rafael noticed was the total absence of sound. Not an ordinary silence, but an absolute void. Not the sound of his own heart, not the sound of breathing. It was as if everything that vibrated, voice, flesh, time, had been ripped from existence. He tried to scream, but there was no air. He tried to run, but his feet wouldn't touch the ground as before. The world had transformed into a static, ethereal model where every detail seemed frozen, except him. It was no longer dawn, nor day, nor night. It was an eternal in-between. A dark room with a milky glow where shadows danced without a light source. The walls of his house existed, but they were distorted, as if seen through a lens of water. Mirrors covered the surfaces. Each showed a different version of himself, Rafael. As a child, Rafael sleeping, Rafael running through mazes that only existed in his nightmares. And in all the mirrors, the clock, marking 3:33. In that suspended world, Rafael found what remained of his great-grandfather. It wasn't a conventional spirit. It was like a conscious memory, a repetition of a corrupted instant. Old Raimundo appeared in flashes, reliving the same act over and over again. With each cycle, he attempted to perform a ritual before the clock, drawing circles on the ground, reciting words in forgotten languages, applying bloody marks to the hands. But always, before he could finish, an invisible force interrupted everything and threw him back to the beginning. It was a karmic loop, trapped not by the error itself, but by the arrogance of trying to escape the gears of fate. Time, as an entity, did not forgive deviations. And now, Rafael was trapped in this cycle. He didn't just see his great-grandfather's past. He felt it, the pain of failure, the guilt embedded in the rituals, the despair of not being able to escape. The clock had become a timeless prison where every second was an eternity on repeat. Rafael wandered through this dimension trying to understand its rules. He discovered that each mirror was a passage. Touching them, he was sucked into other moments. He saw his great-grandfather's childhood, moments when he learned about astrology from an occult master. Nighttime rituals in basements with hand-drawn circles and Latin symbols carved into animal bones. And finally, the decisive moment, Raimundo, now old, standing before the clock murmuring, "If I know when death will come, I can avoid it." Rafael understood. His great-grandfather tried to manipulate time, not out of curiosity, but out of fear. And this fear led him to do the unthinkable, to attempt to break the natural flow of life with a spiritual pact. But the pact failed, or worse, it worked, and sealed the fate of his soul in an eternal restart between the seconds that never advance. And now Rafael was there, not as a spectator, but as an heir to the broken pact. As he walked through the space between the mirrors, he finally heard something beyond the silence. It wasn't sound, it was thought. It was time itself, perhaps, speaking to him. Debt is not paid with blood, it is paid with conscience. He who knows too much remains. Rafael fell to his knees. He understood now that the only way to escape was to choose. Either pay the debt of blood, reliving, like Raimundo, the same moment until the guilt dissolved, or break the cycle, even without knowing what that would entail. But how to break something that is out of time? As he thought, a crack appeared in one of the mirrors. Small, almost imperceptible, but alive. Rafael sensed it was no coincidence. It was a sign, a test, perhaps a way out or a trap. Time, even standing still, seemed to be watching him, and Rafael now understood. The clock never just wanted to show 3:33. He wanted someone who understood what that meant. And Rafael was getting closer and closer to finding out. Time there didn't flow, it vibrated. Rafael no longer felt part of a physical world, but rather a living consciousness, as if he were walking within an ancient thought. Each step echoed in the mirrors that surrounded him, and each echo seemed to bring with it memories that weren't his own. Until he came across a mirrored portal unlike any other. It didn't reflect distorted images or nightmares. It reflected a place he'd never seen but felt he knew. An old room with heavy curtains, melted candles, and chaotically stacked books. In the center, the clock, only new, shining with a golden aura, and beside it, Raimundo. But it wasn't the spirit, nor the trapped spectre. It was a living memory, his great-grandfather's mind, projected like a crystalline fragment in time. Rafael walked through the mirror. As he did so, he didn't feel his body pass, but his mind. It was like falling into another's memory. When he opened his eyes, he was in that room. The light was dim. The walls vibrated with barely audible chants. Raimundo spoke in a low voice, standing before a ritual circle drawn on the floor with ash and oil. In the center, the clock. The hands turned counterclockwise. "Today I cross the border. Today I take control of my final line." The voice was firm, but the eyes revealed terror. Rafael understood. The pact had not been made out of greed. It had been made out of fear of death. Raimundo had discovered, through ancient esoteric texts, that time was not merely a linear measurement. It was an entity, a conscious flow that allowed for gaps, but at a cost. He had found a formula, part mathematical, part spiritual, to glimpse the moment of his own death. The goal was simple, but forbidden, to foresee in order to avoid it. However, when trying to perform the ritual, something went wrong. Rafael watched the scene unfold like a tragic play. The old man was reciting the final verses when the clock began to tremble. The hands turned like blades, and a deep sound, almost like subterranean breathing, invaded the room. The candle went out on its own. The circle of protection was broken. And then time stood still. But not as Rafael had experienced. It was a collapse. Raimundo was thrown to the ground, and the clock stared at him like a furious eye. The symbols engraved on its wood glowed red, and a voice, metallic, whispering, impersonal, resonated within the walls. You will not see death. You will be. The waiting. Rafael felt a chill. The pact had been accepted but reversed. Raimundo didn't gain control over his own death. He gained the burden of waiting eternally for it, trapped between the seconds that never move forward. A punishment for defying laws that don't apply to mortals. And the price. The debt wasn't just spiritual, it was ancestral. Time demanded compensation in blood. And since Rafael was the last direct descendant, he had inherited the continuation of the punishment. Rafael recoiled from the memory, being pulled back into the mirror plane. But now everything was darker. The distorted versions of himself watched in silence. Not a shadow moved, until the ancient voice returned, directly in his mind. You can see. Now you can choose. Rafael fell to his knees. He finally understood the weight of the clock. It didn't measure time, it measured transgression. It was a living seal, a sacred trap. And even worse, the only way to break the cycle was to complete the pact or destroy it. But destroying meant more than breaking an object. It meant sealing forever something that might never be understood. The clock had become a bridge between planes, and cutting it could free or trap everything forever, including him. The decision was approaching. The clock, even when stopped, seemed to be pulsing, as if time were watching him, as if fate itself was awaiting Rafael's verdict. And for the first time, he understood that maybe the debt would never really be forgiven, just transferred. Time between the mirrors was no longer formless. Rafael walked in circles, but each step seemed to take him deeper into himself. The plane he was on was now unstable, as if the boundaries between mind and matter had dissolved. The distorted versions of himself watched him like silent judges. The clock in every corner of this non-place remained fixed at 3:33, and its metallic sound, once clear and defined, now sounded like a scratchy whisper within the soul. Ever since he'd understood the origin of the curse and Raimundo's mistake, Rafael felt the weight of responsibility growing. Time hadn't just stopped for him, now it seemed to live within him. Sometimes he felt his own heartbeat in rhythms matching the metallic ticking of the clock, and in rare moments his thoughts would overlap with the present, seeing fragments of the future and echoes of a past he hadn't lived. It was as if the timeline stretched within his consciousness. It was in this state that his great-grandfather's figure reappeared, but this time different. He was weak, almost translucent, his eyes downcast. He no longer seemed the proud, imprisoned spirit Rafael had encountered in the previous projections. Now, Raimundo was more human, humble. "You've reached the point I couldn't," he said, his lips still. "The choice. I ran from it. I tried to bend time, and now I'm just a reflection." Rafael stared at his own reflection in one of the mirrors. His image watched him with a rigid expression. The hands of the clock inside the mirror began to tremble, and then the sound returned. 3 beats, a pause, 3 beats, a pause. Raimundo's voice returned like a dark breeze. "You can free the bloodline, you can destroy the clock, but every bridge that breaks also closes a cycle. And sometimes what is sealed doesn't remain inactive. Sometimes what is trapped is simply sleeping." Rafael understood. Destroying the clock would mean breaking the cycle of spiritual debt that spanned generations. It would free Raimundo, perhaps even himself, but it would also end the seal's function to keep something confined, something the clock had been watching over since the first transgression. And then came the second option, to remain there, to take his great-grandfather's place, to become the guardian among the seconds, to contain whatever existed on the other side. A conscious but necessary imprisonment. Rafael would be erased from time. No memory, no record, just new air to silence. Two options, neither without consequences. The space he was in began to vibrate. The mirrors trembled. Reality shattered like burning glass. The clock floated before him now, weightless, unsupported. The runes on its wood glowed like embers. It was time. Rafael closed his eyes. He remembered his mother, the ordinary days, the simple things I still wanted to experience. But he also felt, deep down, the awareness of what it meant to allow this to continue, to allow someone else to inherit the curse. He held out his hand. He leaned against the clock. At that instant, the world exploded into light and noise. Rafael felt himself split into 1,000 parts, each pulled in a different direction. Memories, thoughts, pain, everything spun like loose gears. And then the sound stopped. Time returned. He was back in the room. The clock was no longer there. For a moment he thought it was over, but there was a third answer he didn't consider. What if the choice had been made? For him and for the time together? What if the destruction of the clock was not the end, but just the beginning of a new way for the debt to continue? The feeling was clear. Something had ended, but something had also been awakened. The light that engulfed Rafael seemed eternal. There was no pain, but there was no peace either. It was as if he were being remade, particle by particle, in a different mold, a kind of reverse birth. When he finally opened his eyes, he realized he was back in his living room exactly as he had left it. Everything was in its place. The bookshelf, the sofa, the paintings on the wall. The only absence was the most notable, the clock. He was gone. Rafael stood up slowly. His body felt the same, but his mind was strange. He felt as if he were seeing the world through a very thin, almost imperceptible glass. More vivid colors, more detailed sounds, and a constant vibration in his ear, similar to the metallic sound he had heard during so many early mornings. The cell phone on the table read 3:34. For the first time in weeks, time had moved forward. Rafael almost cried. The nightmare was over. He'd destroyed the cycle. He'd broken the curse. He'd saved his great-grandfather. He'd freed the lineage from a debt that had spanned generations. It was the end, but like every ending, there was something out of place. When he walked to the bathroom and turned on the light, he froze in front of the mirror. His reflection was there, normal, but in the background, the clock, not on the bookshelf nor on the table, but reflected there in the glass. Still, imposing, the time was 3:33. Rafael turned around immediately. There was nothing behind him, just the white wall. He looked back at the mirror, and there it was, the same clock, motionless, its black hands pointing to the damned time. More than that, the clock's reflection was present in every mirror in the house, in the microwave's glass, on the black television screen, in the building's elevator mirror, as if it existed only in reflective surfaces and was invisible to the naked eye. With each new mirror, Rafael felt a chill creep up his spine. Time had indeed started to flow again, but something inside him remained, out of sync. A constant ringing in his ears, a slight pain in the back of his neck at 3:33, a chill for no reason. And above all, a strange silence, that same dense silence he had felt on the spiritual plane between the seconds. It was only then that he understood the debt was paid with exchange. Rafael freed Raimundo. He broke the cycle, but in doing so, he made room for a new guardian. And the clock, though destroyed on the physical plane, had found another body in which to manifest. The metallic sound was now coming from inside him. It was as if it had been integrated into his own biological rhythm. He could sometimes hear the metallic ticking between heartbeats, and on quieter nights, he could see the hands moving behind his closed eyelids, even in deep sleep. He always woke at 3:33, without fail, and when he stared at his reflection, he saw his eyes a little darker, heavier, as if something were watching him from behind his own irises. Rafael realized that time now obeyed him, but at the same time, it watched him. It was like having an active device inside his body. It wasn't a seal, it was a substitution. He didn't just destroy the watch, he became the clock. The voices ceased, the nightmares vanished, the sounds stopped, echoing in the rooms. But the metallic sound, once external, now lived within his mind. He was the new balance point between planes, the new link in the bloodline, and what was once just a warning in the early hours of the morning was now a constant cycle. Time was ticking away inside him, silent, patient, eternal. The city went on as usual. Traffic continued, horns honked, people crossed the sidewalks unaware that in that ordinary apartment, in a building without history, someone had crossed the line between what is measured in seconds and what is sustained beyond time. To the world, Rafael was just another person, but inside him, something had changed forever. For the first week after his return, Rafael tried to ignore it. He tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. He bought flowers, cleaned the house, and returned to work. His colleagues found him more introspective, but not different enough to raise suspicions. It was as if he knew his job perfectly, or as if he'd been replaced by an improved version, or worse, by a mocked version. Every night he woke at the same minute, 3:33. No alarm, no noise, no cause. He just woke. Eyes open, breathing deeply, feeling the world suspended for a moment. And then he heard it. Not an external sound, but a metallic echo, dull, like the beating of a hammer against a bell inside the skull. 3 rings, a pause. 3 rings, always the same, always coming from within. The mirrors in the house were no longer mere objects. As he passed them, Rafael saw his reflection seconds later. A slight delay, as if time were out of sync. Sometimes, when he looked closely, he noticed that his reflection blinked before him, or that his eyes didn't move with his head. And most disturbingly, in every mirror, the old clock remained there, still, firm, marking 3:33. One night, Rafael covered all the mirrors with sheets. He needed peace, but as he did so, he began to have visions in surfaces that never reflected anything. In the still, water in the sink, in the blade of a knife, in the moonlit window pane, the reflection followed him. The clock, now non-existent in the physical world, lived on every possible plane. He was omnipresent, and Rafael finally understood what he had inherited, not just the debt, but the function. Rafael was now the guardian of unbalanced time, the point between worlds, Raimundo's replacement. And with this role came new abilities. He began to notice things he shouldn't have, small gaps in time, people repeating themselves, walking down the street as if trapped in a cycle, children looking at him with frightened eyes, even though they didn't know him, clocks stopping around him, distant sounds coming from underground, like gears turning beneath the earth. And most of all, moments where time failed, like that morning when a bus passed him twice on the same corner, or the afternoon he saw a man crossing the street and seconds later saw him again, on the other side, repeating the same gestures. Small cracks in time, fissures, and Rafael knew he was the stopper, the seal, the last working gear before time slipped into chaos. He began recording these failures. He created a diary of time lapses, and with each entry, he felt the clock inside him tick, as if recognizing the world's errors, as if now it was up to Rafael to maintain order. It wasn't a gift, it was a burden. One morning, he received a call, an unknown number. When he answered, there was silence, just 3 metallic sounds. And then, a whispered voice. Others are waking up. The warning was clear. Rafael wasn't the only link. Somewhere, more people touched by time were beginning to emerge. Other human cogs, other guardians, or perhaps other threats. He hung up the phone with a trembling hand. He leaned against the wall. His heart beat in regular rhythms, but between them, the sound, the same sound. Now, Rafael no longer saw the watch as a cursed object. It was an entity, an organism, and he was part of it. Time did move again, yes, But it would never be the same again. Rafael was no longer just a man. He was the exact point where time stops, observes, and decides whether to continue. And at 3:33 every morning, the clock looked back.